Amasai, si Sityaawks di bayu simgaget sadagamhanak, luam garawilksuk. My name is Sityaawks, and I come from the Simshan and Gitxsan First Nations, and thank you so much for that warm introduction. I share with you the nations that I'm from because you know who I'm accountable to personally, and that I'm here in my role as Associate Deputy Minister with the province of BC for the Declaration Act Secretariat, which doesn't tell you what I do. But essentially, I advance the implementation of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People within the province of British Columbia and have for the past 5 years. What does that mean when it comes to economies and banking? Well, in Canada, we have a few things to acknowledge and move through. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge that we are on the unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabeg peoples here in Ottawa. This is an unsurrendered, unceded territory, which means there is no treaty with the Government of Canada that has released its title. So you are on title lands of the Anishinaabeg people. And that has specific financial consequences for this country and in territories across this country because the process of confederation is unfinished and the ongoing colonial impacts of that confederation are unsettled. And what that means is a lot for all of us. And so there's a couple of things I want to touch on. One, why am I here? That has a lot to do with Thomas. Thomas and I met when we were working in the province with the Mazzucato Institute, looking at ways in which a very NDP government wanted to influence our economy on matters that they pertained of particular interest to our citizens. Of course, one of those interests in this country is reconciliation, and it is a court-mandated process. Now, for those of you in Canada, reconciliation sounds like a word that we understand. For those of you outside of Canada, perhaps you have some reference to it. But here, what it means is that we are the only country in the world that has had a court-mandated reconciliation process for the attempted genocide of Indigenous people. Every other country that has experienced a genocide has put that obligation on themselves. Here in Canada, Indigenous people took the state to court. And part of that was the settlement agreement. And so the work that I advance today has been advanced by survivors of genocide, taken to residential schools. We have also recently disclosed, which is something Indigenous people always knew, that all of these residential schools in Canada had graveyards. And so there are thousands of Indigenous children that never returned. We have stolen ancestors. And all of this has certain impacts on our community, and economic ones most of all. Not only were our future ancestors taken, our lands were taken, our waters polluted, and legally, when we advance cases, the state has consistently lost for the past 25 years because we have a constitution that protects the rights of Indigenous people in this country. So in 1982, quick history lesson, I'll try and be brief, we adopted Section 35 that affirms the inherent rights of Indigenous people in the country. It doesn't create rights, it affirms them. At the same time, we added the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And we as Canadians wrapped ourselves in the Charter. And every province and state, every territory was given 3 years to align all of our laws with the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And now every law that we introduce has a little statement that says it's compliant with the Charter. What did we do with Section 35? We have litigated it since 1982 and described it as an empty box of rights. And since that litigation has happened, we have consistently lost. Now, most of it has been around land and resources. Who has the sovereignty and authority to decide on whose territory you do things? We've talked a little bit earlier today about a pipeline in the Dakotas. There are pipelines in Canada, and we often talk about consent. Well, consent is inextricably linked to these inherent rights and to the redress and the human rights that we have attached to that. And so what that means is UNDRIP represents the minimum standards for the survival and dignity of Indigenous people around the world. And here in Canada, we've brought that in as a federal bill, and BC brought that in our state or our province as the first jurisdiction in the Western world to do so. We put a positive obligation on ourselves to do a number of things. Now, if you have the opportunity to pull up that picture, This is why I do what I do. So rarely is there a law in this country written as if Indigenous people exist, and that it's a positive law that recognizes our humanity. We have the Indian Act, and we have a number of laws written to justifiably infringe on the human rights of this young woman. So think about that when you think about banking. And so I'm going to come to that now. We are in the process of title cases, treaty negotiation, new fiscal relationships, revenue sharing, shared decision-making. And we have all of this to do at a time when we are still proving that she has human rights, that she is human, that her rights have meaning, and that we have an obligation to protect them. Imagine if the only time you're mentioned in legislation is for a way to infringe upon your rights. And that is the same for our economic system. Where I come from, we eat like royalty. We are surrounded by salmon and crab and cockles, things that are paid for a premium here. And yet, we are redlined. Most of our communities, our houses depreciate. Can you imagine living on the northwest coast of British Columbia, surrounded by multi-million-dollar houses, but because you're behind the red line, you're on a reservation and you don't actually have title to your own land? That the value of your house depreciates the longer you live in it. It is a depreciating asset. You have no access to capital to leverage off of that land. And if for some reason you have been able to secure economic development, own source revenues, large amounts of money to support your community and your community's interests, who holds that money? And are they actively invested in infringing on the rights of your people? Is that bank invested in a pipeline that you might be actively opposing with your inherent rights to consent or not? And so that obligation around how we do redress when we involve Indigenous people in matters that affect them is inherently linked to our economic programs and what we advance with that. And right now, somebody in Vancouver is like, those aren't the speaking notes. Because, yeah, still wearing the provincial hat. Can't see it, but it's always there. And part of this is because we have to put things in really plain language. What's her future going to be, and what is our investment in her? Right now, our system has that maybe she'll graduate, maybe. And so what we did is we started to look at the opposite of the status quo when we developed the action plan. So we pass a law. It requires us to do a few things. One, take all measures necessary to align our laws with UNDRIP. Two, to create an action plan to achieve the objectives of UNDRIP. And three, to report out annually. Those are the obligations. We also enabled two other pieces. One was to enter into consent agreements with nations. Can you imagine? Can you imagine? I mean, that puts fear in the heart of bankers. What are Indigenous people going to do with the jurisdiction they have to say yes, no, maybe under these conditions? And yet this is the unfinished business that courts of our own Supreme Court have been pushing us to 25 years. You have to come up with a system that figures it out. And there are financial components to that. And there are financial interests to that. We're very good at sharing jurisdiction on things that cost us money. Healthcare, child welfare. When it comes to things that make us money as states, we are less sure. And so governments tend to get something I call government vertigo when we talk about consent, free, prior, and informed consent. And that puts shudders into the backs of bankers across the country. And they look at the floor and the ceiling, and governments go, what does that mean? But we teach that in business acquisition, full disclosure. We teach that in sexual health. And yet somehow when it comes to Indigenous people, we get vertigo about what it means to say yes, no, with these conditions, follow our laws, inform us. And so this is the work that states actually have to do, just like we've done in any other way. Can you imagine making decisions over gendered health and not involving women? And yet that is what happens when it comes to Indigenous people. And it happens when it comes to banking. It happens when it comes to economies. And I have to say, our economies, since time immemorial, have been sustainable greed, and we're the OGs of sustainability. And we're also very good at investing in resources, resource extraction, resource development in a sustainable way. And so there is work to be done here. It doesn't mean that a nation will say no, but it should be informed by their interests as well. And so these are sovereign states that are reemerging with their sovereignty, and there's a role within the economy to ensure that that is equitable, accessible, just, and self-determined. And with that, I will probably leave you there. I didn't see the 2-minute thing, but I get on a rant. This is my soapbox. But with that, I really want to thank Thomas for the work that we did previously, but also for inviting me to this forum. I've learned an incredible bunch and connected with some lovely people. And I do believe that public banking can be one of the solutions that we have to some of the problems presented by the unfinished task of reconciliation. Hamia.